Why do empaths disappear from your life without any warning? No argument, no final conversation, no emotional explosion, just silence. And what makes it even more confusing is this: you don't notice it happening in real time. You only realize it when the emotional distance is already complete. So the real question isn't why they left, but why you didn't see it forming in the first place. Because empaths don't disappear suddenly. They disappear after a psychological process you completely miss. You assume empaths are emotional, sensitive, and reactive, but that assumption misses the deeper layer. Empaths don't process life the way most people do. You react to moments. They analyze patterns. You move on quickly. They store emotional information. Every interaction you have with an empath is being processed internally, even when they look completely normal on the outside. So when they disappear, it's not a sudden decision. It's the final stage of something that was building for a long time. If this topic interests you, subscribe. The first reason empaths disappear is emotional overload. Here's what that actually means. Empaths don't express emotional pain immediately the way most people do. They don't react fast. They don't argue instantly. And they don't always show when something hurts them. Instead, they absorb it. Not just emotionally, but psychologically. Every interaction you have with them gets processed on a deeper level than you realize. A small inconsistency in your behavior, a moment where you ignored something important to them, a time when you were emotionally unavailable when they needed you the most, even a slightly dismissive tone you didn't think twice about. For you, these moments are small, forgettable, normal human behavior. You move on instantly, but empaths don't. They register these moments internally, and instead of releasing them outwardly, they store them quietly in their emotional system. No reaction, no complaint, no confrontation. Now imagine this happening repeatedly over time. One moment doesn't matter. A single mistake doesn't change anything. Even a few mistakes can be overlooked. But hundreds of small emotional moments, that becomes something else entirely. It creates internal weight. And this is where most people misunderstand empaths. They assume because there is no reaction, there is no impact. But silence is not absence of feeling. It is processing without expression. At first, they try to understand you. They rationalize your behavior. They give you the benefit of the doubt. They tell themselves, maybe you didn't mean it. Maybe it was just a bad moment. Maybe things will be different next time. But emotionally, the system keeps filling up. Slowly, quietly, consistently, until there is no more space left to hold anything new. At that point, something important happens. They don't argue. They don't explode. They don't create drama. Because emotional overload in empaths doesn't turn into chaos. It turns into shutdown, a complete internal withdrawal. They stop reacting the way they used to. They stop engaging emotionally at the same level. And eventually, they stop trying to explain what they feel. Not because they don't care, but because they've already carried too much for too long. And when that emotional saturation point is reached, they don't leave loudly. They leave quietly from the inside first, before they ever leave your life physically. The second reason empaths disappear is pattern recognition. This is where things become deeply psychological. Empaths don't judge you based on a single action. They don't define you by one mistake, one argument, or one emotional moment. Instead, they observe something far more subtle and far more powerful: repetition. They are not reacting to what you did once. They are reacting to what you keep doing over time. For example, if you become emotionally distant whenever things get difficult, or if you show inconsistency when emotional effort is required, or if your presence becomes unpredictable depending on your mood or convenience, they notice it. Not immediately, not emotionally, but silently over time. At first, they don't jump to conclusions. In fact, they often do the opposite. They give you the benefit of the doubt. They assume it was just a bad day. They tell themselves maybe you were stressed, distracted, or not in the right headspace. They try to understand you instead of judging you. But psychologically, the human brain is always building patterns in the background. It's constantly collecting behavioral data without conscious awareness. And empaths, more than most people, are highly sensitive to this process. They start connecting dots that you don't even realize exist. One moment becomes part of a sequence. One behavior becomes part of a pattern. And slowly, an internal model of you begins to form in their mind. And once that model becomes stable, something shifts. They no longer respond to your words in the same way, because words lose weight when behavior keeps repeating something different. Instead, they start responding to your consistency, not what you promise, not what you explain, but what you repeatedly demonstrate. And this is where emotional attachment begins to change, because attachment is not just built on connection, it is maintained through reliability. When consistency is strong, attachment grows deeper. But when consistency breaks repeatedly, even in small ways, trust doesn't break suddenly, it erodes gradually. And when that erosion reaches a point where the pattern becomes clear, the emotional bond doesn't collapse loudly. It fades quietly, without confrontation, without explanation, without warning. Because once an empath understands your pattern, they are no longer surprised by your behavior. And when surprise disappears from attachment, distance begins. The third reason is subtle trust breakdown. Most people assume trust only breaks through big, obvious betrayals, something dramatic, something undeniable, something that forces a clear ending. But for empaths, that's not how trust actually works. Their trust doesn't collapse in one moment. It erodes in micro moments. Small emotional experiences that seem insignificant on the surface, but carry psychological weight over time. For example, when you didn't respond emotionally at a moment they needed understanding, when you dismissed something that was important to them because it didn't seem important to you, or when you didn't show up in the way they naturally expected from someone they were emotionally invested in. Individually, none of these moments feel serious. You might not even remember them. You might move on instantly, thinking nothing meaningful happened. But empaths don't process emotional connection in isolated incidents. Psychologically, the brain doesn't store experiences as separate files. It connects them. It builds associations. It forms emotional patterns over time. And that is where the shift begins. Each small moment adds to an internal emotional map of how safe, how consistent, and how reliable you are. Not based on what you say, but based on how you show up repeatedly. And slowly, without you realizing it, that internal map starts to change. Once trust begins to shift internally, something very subtle happens in their perception of you. Your presence doesn't feel the same anymore. It's not that you suddenly become a different person. It's not that you do something extreme. It's that their internal emotional response to you starts adjusting based on accumulated experiences. Even when nothing obvious has changed externally, something has already changed internally. And this is the part most people miss completely. Because you're still interacting the same way you always have, while they are no longer experiencing you the same way they used to. Trust doesn't break loudly for empaths. It shifts quietly. And once that internal shift reaches a certain point, emotional safety decreases. When emotional safety decreases, attachment naturally weakens. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, silently, and without any visible warning. By the time you realize something is different, the trust has already been rewritten inside them. The fourth reason is silent detachment. This is one of the most important stages in how empaths disappear, and also the one you almost never notice while it's happening. Because empaths don't leave emotionally at the same moment they leave physically. They disconnect internally first. And that emotional departure always happens long before any visible change in behavior. From your perspective, everything still looks normal. You might still be talking to them regularly. You might still be seeing them in your routine. You might still assume that the connection is intact because there is no obvious conflict, no final argument, and no clear ending point. But internally, something very different is happening. Their emotional engagement starts to decrease gradually. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in extremely subtle stages that are almost impossible to detect in real time. First, their emotional response begins to soften. Things that once triggered excitement, warmth, or deep connection no longer create the same level of emotional intensity. Then their expectations begin to change. They stop expecting the same level of emotional understanding, consistency, or presence from you. Not because they want less, but because they are slowly preparing themselves for less. After that, their engagement naturally starts to drop. Conversations feel lighter. Emotional depth reduces. Their investment in the connection becomes quieter, more controlled, and more distant. But here is the key point. All of this happens internally first. So while you are still experiencing the relationship as normal, they are already experiencing it as something that is slowly fading. This is why silent detachment is so dangerous in emotional dynamics with empaths, because there are no warning signs that feel obvious enough for you to act on. There is no clear moment where you realize something has changed. Instead, it feels like everything is still fine, until suddenly it isn't. And this gradual shift is exactly why you miss it completely. By the time they physically withdraw, by the time they stop responding the same way, stop engaging the same way, or eventually disappear from your life, the emotional departure has already happened long before that moment. You are not witnessing the beginning of their exit. You are only witnessing the final confirmation of a decision that was already made internally. And that is why it feels so sudden to you, even though it was never sudden for them. The fifth reason is self-protection activation. At a certain point in the emotional experience of an empath, something shifts internally. It's not something you can see from the outside, and it's not something that happens in a dramatic or emotional way. There is no anger involved. There is no desire for revenge. There is no emotional explosion. What actually happens is much quieter and much deeper. It is exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, but emotional and psychological exhaustion built over time from carrying more than they were meant to carry in a connection that feels unbalanced. When emotional imbalance continues for too long, when they are constantly giving more than they are receiving, constantly understanding more than they are being understood, constantly adjusting while nothing changes from the other side, something in the mind begins to shift. The brain naturally adapts to protect itself, and that is when it switches modes, from connection mode to protection mode. In connection mode, empaths try to understand, fix, adjust, and stay emotionally available. They try to make things work, even when it costs them internally. They explain, they tolerate, they interpret your behavior in the most forgiving way possible. But in protection mode, everything changes. Explanations stop carrying emotional weight. Fixing the situation no longer feels necessary or even possible. Understanding your side no longer feels like a priority. Because the emotional system is no longer focused on maintaining the connection. It is focused on preventing further emotional damage. And in this state, only one thing matters: emotional safety. Not the relationship, not the conversation, not the explanation, only safety. And if your presence becomes linked in their mind with emotional exhaustion, inconsistency, or internal stress, their system starts to classify that connection as unsafe. Once that classification happens, their behavior changes automatically. They stop engaging the same way. They stop explaining what they feel. They stop trying to repair what is broken. Not because they don't care anymore, but because caring has become too costly emotionally. And this is where most people misunderstand the final stage. They expect confrontation. They expect closure. They expect communication. But in self-protection mode, empaths don't operate through confrontation. They operate through withdrawal. And so instead of fighting, instead of explaining, instead of creating a final emotional moment, they simply leave. Quietly, completely, and without emotional noise. Because at that point, leaving is not a decision driven by emotion. It is a decision driven by survival. There is no dramatic ending when an empath finally leaves. No final argument that explains everything. No emotional confrontation that clears the air. No closure conversation that gives you answers or closure. From the outside, it doesn't even look like an ending at first. It simply looks like distance. At the beginning, it is almost unnoticeable. A slight shift in energy. A subtle change in the way they communicate. Nothing that feels serious enough to question or confront. Then, gradually, that distance starts increasing. Less presence in conversations, less emotional energy in responses, less engagement in moments that once felt meaningful and connected. And because these changes don't happen suddenly, your mind adjusts to them without resistance. You normalize them. You tell yourself everything is still fine. You assume they are just busy, distracted, or temporarily distant. But internally, the process has already been completed long ago. The emotional connection that once felt alive is no longer active in the same way. The empath has already gone through the internal stages of detachment long before any visible change reached your awareness. So when the final stage finally arrives, there is nothing sudden about it from their perspective. It is only the last visible step of a process that finished internally much earlier. And eventually it reaches a point where there is nothing left to interpret. No emotional signals to decode, no responses to analyze, no presence to rely on. Just complete absence. And that is when the confusion fully sets in. Because what feels sudden to you was never sudden for them. It was a long, silent internal exit, unfolding gradually over time, long before the silence became visible in your reality. Empaths don't disappear because they are unstable. That's the misunderstanding most people carry when they look back at the situation. From the outside, it feels sudden, confusing, and emotionally incomplete. But internally, that is not how it happens. Empaths disappear because they become aware of patterns that repeat over time, aware of emotional imbalance that keeps building silently, aware of their own psychological and emotional limits. And this awareness doesn't come from one moment. It develops gradually through experience, observation, and internal processing. At first, they try to understand, they try to adjust, they try to give meaning and patience to situations that don't feel balanced. But over time, awareness starts to turn into clarity. And once that clarity forms, something important changes inside them. They no longer stay in environments where their emotional system is constantly drained, ignored, or overextended. Not because they want to punish anyone, not because they stop caring instantly, but because self-preservation becomes stronger than emotional attachment. At that point, staying no longer feels like connection, it feels like depletion. So they choose distance. Not loudly, not emotionally, not dramatically, but quietly and completely. And this is where the misunderstanding happens. Because when you look back, it feels like they left suddenly, like something changed overnight, like there was no warning. But psychologically, that is not what happened. They didn't leave suddenly. They left long before you noticed, in small internal stages that were invisible from your perspective, but very real from theirs. If this video made sense to you or changed the way you see emotional dynamics, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more psychological insights like this. And comment below, have you ever experienced someone disappearing like this without explanation?